I want to thank ACGIH for honoring me with this award. It is especially important to me since I knew Herb Stokinger and thought highly of him. Today I'd like to discuss a chemical that's captured our imagination the past 20 years, and that's the PFAS chemicals. When we recognized about 30 years ago, or even maybe 20 years ago, they are present in all living organisms, or at least all living species around the globe. This reminded us of the dioxins back some 40 to 50 years ago. And I want to focus today on what might be learned from that experience. So the title is, Can 4 Decades of Experience with Dioxins Inform Scientists and Regulatory Agencies about how to regulate the PFAS chemicals? Before proceeding, I must confess that I'm an old school toxicologist. To me, dose is nearly everything. Whole animal studies are really important, but for the PFAS chemicals and dioxins, epidemiology studies are invaluable. And you'll see that as I proceed through this lecture. Herb had a big legacy. He was a pioneering toxicologist in occupational and environmental health, almost before toxicology was a separate profession. He was instrumental in establishing the TLV values. Warren Cook's considered the father of the TLVs, and Herb is considered the son of the TLVs, or at least the person that really brought them to bear. He was a key figure also in the U.S. Public Health Service, served on many ACGIH committees, advanced quantitative methods for dose response, helped shape regulatory frameworks for chemicals, and contributed to the foundation principles of modern industrial hygiene. It's interesting that 40 years ago this month, I received a letter from Herb. I had just finished my chapter in Patty's toxicology. I was a young person at the time and was honored to ask to write about the history of the TLVs and how they were set and how the occupational exposure limits are set around the world. So that was 40 years ago. I have written the chapters on setting TLVs and the history of TLVs for Patty's since that time. Herb was also a bit of a jokester. He wrote me this letter and said at the end, I guess you have a natural proclivity to complexity, which you would do well to curb. I had to laugh when I read that. This talk is got 7 pieces. The first is the scientific and regulatory challenges. Is there something we can learn, as I said, from this dioxin experience? I want to review the half-life of these chemicals and the acute and chronic toxicity, the epidemiology, the MCL of 4-PPT that was passed last year, and what it means to society, and then offer some ideas about a path forward. We're facing a significant decision about how to regulate PFOS, PFOA, which have been the most studied of the PFAS chemicals. It is perhaps the most financially impactful rulemaking in the history of the environmental revolution. That began in 1962 with Rachel Carson's book. Now, let me be clear. The US EPA needs to regulate PFAS in water, which would be the MCLs, the maximum contaminant levels. However, I'm suggesting that this challenge be tackled objectively and thoughtfully. Thus far, it's been tackled with a lot of emotion and various pressure groups being brought to bear on the process. I think we need to do this, otherwise we're going to open the door to some numerous unfortunate outcomes which I believe are not necessary. So, regulating the PFAS chemicals in drinking water at the proposed MCL of 4-PPT could cost the U.S. either several $100 billion or perhaps $1 trillion. This is described in the Bloomberg articles about this regulatory initiative. EPA proposed in 2023 to go to 4-PPT. It had been at 70 as an advisory for drinking water in 2016. When they did the analysis for the cost of complying to 4 PPT, it was estimated to be $3 to $5 billion a year, which was, I think, extraordinarily low, and the capital cost to be $30 billion. When they translated this into what it costs the homeowner to comply with 4 PPT, they estimated $80 to $11,000 per year per household in the affected communities. $11,000 a year for some communities. And this just makes sense because some filtration systems are so important, but the system's small, and therefore you don't get the ability to dilute the cost. PFAS cleanups at DoD sites were expected to be $9 billion, but that didn't include the 1,300 additional surplus sites. Some thought that the remediation of 4 PPT may take even 100 years with no clear closure timelines. It was a very big challenge to estimate the impact. OMB worked on this for upwards of 2 years, and I think they did not even get close to getting it right because they didn't have complete information. What can we learn from the dioxin experience? And I'm going to bracket that to be 1985 to 2010. To begin, my past is heavily entwined with the dioxins. In 1984, I was assigned to a team to deal with the dioxin contamination of Times Beach, Missouri. That was the first and only town in America to be purchased by the government due to a toxicant, which was dioxin. It had been sprayed on the roads to control dust. It was actually thought to be recycled oil from crankcases, but then they found that's what it was, but it had been contaminated with dioxins from a chemical plant. Over the next, I guess, almost 30 years, I published 20 papers on the dioxins, and I served on numerous scientific panels in the United States and elsewhere. So I think the journey with the dioxins and furans should give us pause as we begin to regulate PFOS and PFOA, as well as 40 other PFAS chemicals in various media, and that means soil, food, sediments. More recently, I've spent the last 3 years studying the PFAS chemicals. I worked for nearly a year in Washington, D.C., trying to see if EPA might reflect on their proposal, because I thought it was a dramatic step for them to take, given the costs associated with the remediation efforts. I've been struck by the similarities, as I said, between the dioxins and furans, and how much the regulatory trajectory for PFAS has been much like the dioxins. When that occurred, I was nervous about the total cost of the country, which was quite significant, and I was not clear that the nation's health would be improved much, or if at all, if we regulated the dioxins heavily. With respect to PFAS, our groups had 4 papers published in the last 3 months, and it's not difficult to find those. They're cited here at the bottom. So what are the PFAS chemicals? Well, as you know, they're called the forever chemicals. That's an unfortunate term, but it's certainly captured our imagination. There are about 800 to 12,000 of these. Not all of them are manufactured. In fact, the vast majority are breakdown products. So it's kind of a misleading term to say there's 8 to 12,000 of them. There's really less than 100 in commerce that are very significant. So it isn't as formidable and insurmountable a task to regulate these chemicals as one might think. Of course, it's been used for decades in thousands of applications. It's environmentally and biologically persistent, and it's found, as I said at the beginning, it's found in the blood of all humans, animals, and aquatic species. Let's contrast that with the dioxins. They were called the most toxic chemical known to man, also an unfortunate term. It's a family of 210 structurally related chemicals. They had a common mechanism of action, which we don't know is true for the PFAS chemicals. They, of course, were like PFAS, environmentally and biologically persistent, and they were found in the blood of all mammals and aquatic species. Both chemicals occupied the news frequently at their various peak of interest. I think that probably the peak of interest is when someone tried to poison the president of Ukraine with dioxin. I received a call from CDC one night, as did 3 or 4 other toxicologists active in the study of dioxin, and all 4 of us very quickly recognized that someone tried to poison him with dioxin. What they didn't know is that it's incredibly toxic in animals, but not for humans. He was scarred with chloracne, which is basically looks like adolescent uh, acne vulgaris, but it tends to appear not only in the face, but any portion of the body that's been touched or is systemically addressed. So it goes back a long way, our understanding of the dioxins. 1899, it was seen, chloracne was seen in the chlorine workers, and then they realized what was going on and they were able to avoid exposure. In 1962 to 1970, we recognized dioxins were in Agent Orange in Vietnam. In 78, Dr. Kosiba at Dow Chemical identified cancer at very low doses in animals. Between 1985 and 2005, that's a 20-year period, we studied it heavily, and month by month, different adverse effects were alleged. And I'll talk about that. They were alleged, not found to be causal necessarily, but alleged. And this is what happens when a chemical becomes highly visible and becomes a topic of interest to hundreds of researchers. I mentioned the poisoning of President Yushchenko, and for 35 years, and it sounds to a young person almost insane to spend 35 years debating about the toxicology of a chemical, but that's what we did. Similarly, the PFAS chemicals have been in the news, and originally it caught our attention because more than 330 species were found to be contaminated with this family of chemicals, just like the dioxins. The brief history of PFOA, for example, is very similar to the dioxins. In the 1940s, PFAS production and use in industry began. Between 1960 and 1980, there were various mixed results in toxicology studies. In 1981, there was concern about developmental effects, again, very similar to the dioxins. And then the cancer risk was identified in animals. In 2012, there was a study of the Faroe Islands where the researchers thought there was a decreased effectiveness of vaccines in children. It turned out they weren't biologically relevant, but there was an apparent change. That has yet to be confirmed. Between 2010 and 2025, a myriad of possible effects were assigned to the PFAS chemicals. Again, very similar to the dioxins. In the face of not definitive data, nearly any claim has been brought to the attention of the public. You would not expect these two classes of chemicals to be very similar based on structure, but in many ways they are. Both are environmentally, biologically persistent, as well as lacking in adverse health effects at typical daily doses. Some would say that even at doses 100 to 500-fold above background, you wouldn't expect adverse effects. So let's compare these two for a second across several endpoints. The dioxin structure is shown here on the left. This is the 2378 TCDD, and then on the right you see PFOA. Absolutely no similarity from a molecular structure standpoint. The history is fascinating for me at least over the years, and again, very similar to what we're going to talk about with the PFAS chemicals. As I said, it started out with observing chloracne in the late 1800s. It was a byproduct of industrial processes. Then it was featured with the veterans in Vietnam. There was a big explosion in Italy in 1976 where thousands of people were impacted. Then we began a 40-year journey as to how to regulate these chemicals, and you'll see why it took 40 years, and we still never reached agreement on exactly what the adverse effects were at various doses, even to this day. PFAS chemicals very similar. They were developed in the 1940s. There were mixed toxicology findings. As I said, developmental toxicity was thought to be a concern. The Haskell labs of DuPont had a rodent study that had positive cancer at high doses. Then down all the way to 2016, we attempted to set a water standard, drinking water standard, and then we promulgated one in 2024. I expect the next 20 to 25 years of equivocal results, frankly. I think that this is going to be just as confusing to us as the dioxins for the reasons I'm going to describe. But I think we have at least 10 to 25 years of epidemiology studies across many doses to figure out really how much should we be concerned at current doses or fractions of current doses or multiples of current doses. The elimination half-lives of these two classes of chemicals are interesting. You'll see that in the rat, the half-life is fairly short, short for a big molecule, 15, 53, and 4 days for the dioxins PFOS and PFOA. But you note in humans, it's markedly longer, 2,831 days for the dioxins, and for the PFAS chemicals, you could average it and say 1,000 days, far greater than in the two typical animal species that can predict humans, especially if you use a PBPK model. The LD50 is also interesting, fascinating really. You'll see that the dioxins are highly toxic on an LD50 basis in the mouse and in the rat, and the fluorinateds also have significant toxicity compared to other chemicals. But look at what happens in humans. We have not been able to identify an adverse effect that includes lethality in humans. Entirely different in their, again, these two chemicals have surprised us with respect to the response in humans. In short, dioxins had never killed anyone, even when we tried. And it would appear that Russia many times tried to kill people with the dioxins, and of course it didn't work. The LD50 is probably 100 to 10,000 times higher than in animals. As I mentioned, the hallmark is chloracne, and we've known that since 1899. We've been unable to find a lethal dose for PFOA and PFOS. You would have expected there to be a lethal dose. You might have even expected someone over the years with very high levels to have been seriously injured. That has not been the case. The Casiba rat study captured our imagination. It was incredibly potent in the species tested. And interestingly, the epidemiology studies, although producing mixed results for 20 years, at the end of the 40 years of study, there was no consensus that it was carcinogenic in humans. And that's why the EPA basically abandoned the reassessment about 10 years ago, almost 15 years ago, because they knew the data would never be sufficient to satisfy both sides of the argument. So it had been essentially regulated by concern rather than regulation by 2010. You can summarize the cancer epidemiology for the dioxins via the Buffetta study in 2011. He looked at many different cohorts, and they concluded the epidemiological evidence for carcinogenicity is just not sufficient, and they called it remains limited. They also said recent epidemiology evidence falls far short of conclusively demonstrating a causal association. Now, you'll find government documents that come right close to saying dioxin causes cancer in humans, but I can't think of one that definitively says that. You get the impression that they believe it, but you have to read the words quite carefully. It's kind of similar with PFOS and PFOA. ATSDR noted that the highest dose in animal studies, the incidence of hepatocellular carcinoma was not significantly increased. Some believe it was. And the 3M and DuPont studies, however, were negative, and some of these workers were fairly highly exposed. The National Toxicology Program didn't entirely agree with the conclusions of Butenhoff and those of the DuPont epidemiologists, but again, this is characteristic of these families of persistent chemicals. This is summarized nicely in Stenlin and Winquist's work of 2021. They looked at, as Buffetta had done with the dioxins, they looked at PFOA, PFOS. Those were the ones that were easily found in the blood and also were the primary PFAS chemicals to which workers had been exposed. They concluded, like Buffetta, overall the evidence for an association between cancer and PFAS remains sparse. Interesting other aspects when you compare the two chemicals. Both cause wasting syndrome. I'm not familiar with any other class of chemicals that causes wasting syndrome. This means you eat at your normal rate and yet you continue to lose weight and eventually die if you keep on eating these the food that's contaminated with these chemicals. The dioxins work through the ACGIH receptor, whereas PFOS and PFOA seem to produce downregulation of lipogenesis in rodents, and that's what causes them to get wasting syndrome. Interestingly, humans don't look like they have any possibility for wasting syndrome, and this is because the PPAR alpha does not cause cell proliferation in humans as it does in the rodents. So that explains a lot of the difference between what we see in animals for PFAS chemicals and what we see in humans. Thank goodness the mechanisms of action are insightful. As I mentioned before, the results were kind of confusing at best, mixed results, some might call it. I found it simply a chemical looking for a disease for 40 years. It certainly deserved our attention. It certainly deserved all the study it got. But look at the unevenness of what we learned. The Casiba study in '76 identified cancer. Then shortly thereafter, an epidemiology said, I think it causes lung cancer. Another one came down the pipe that was very heavily cited, said, I think it causes soft tissue sarcoma. Then it was alleged to cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Then some other people reported it caused diabetes. Then others reported it caused an increase in all cancer, which that would be unusual. The only thing that causes an increase in most or many cancers is radiation and the hormones, certain hormones, at certain doses. The EPA, just as I said, could never, after 30 years, reach agreement with the Science Advisory Board on the characteristics of dioxin, and you'll see it was regulated by public concern rather than aggressive regulatory posture. Fascinating journey with PFAS chemicals. Again, very similar. It started out being polymer fume fever in workers. Then there were some equivocal findings about cancer in the West Virginia workers. Then they saw some increased cholesterol in study populations, just as we did with dioxins. Then some people said, well, it looks like at the C8 study, there may be a probable link between PFAS and 6 different conditions. And then, as I mentioned, the Faroe Island studies were reported. And then over the course of 10 different years, equivocal epidemiology studies came out. To me, whenever you see erratic results time after time, you probably will conclude none of them are accurate. Okay, that's just not the way science works. And indeed, I think the jury will indicate to us that we really didn't understand either of these chemicals, at least up to the current day. So, as I said, history tells us a story here. When animal and human studies consistently yield inconsistent results across several biological endpoints, history tells us you're probably looking at artifact. You're looking at a fake out. And a good fake out is shown here. That's a dinosaur bone on the left, and you'll see it's remarkably similar to the eye to an elephant bone. That's a fake out, and it's an artifact. Persistent chemicals all have, or most of them, if not all of them, have similar toxicology profiles. And these are four that were captured our imagination the last 50 years. Interestingly, DDT, PCB, DECA, and HCBD all are highly lipid soluble, but there's no apparent lethal dose in humans and no apparent cancer risk in humans at any plausible dose. Fascinating. All positive in animal studies. So, with all this mixed data and results and lots of public concern and litigation and regulatory concern, these chemicals have been the center of lively debates with respect to toxicity, threat to public health, cost benefit, risk management, and risk communication. There have been at least 8 books written about these two chemicals. They're fascinating to read, but you can feel the advocacy in those books, either to the left or to the right or the middle. What about blood levels in the U.S.? This is what we call the gold standard. Like so many environmental challenges, sometimes widespread concern about a chemical changes numerous industrial and human behaviors. This is before regulatory action or while regulatory action is being argued. In the court of public opinion, companies, people change their behaviors long before there are good definitive results. So the threat of aggressive regulation, in this case, preceded heavy-handed regulatory action. And you can see the same is true for the dioxins, the furans, and the PCBs. Over the course of about 1995 to 2008, a 20-year span, you saw the drop of anywhere between 50 to 90% in blood levels in adults in the United States. Again, concern and action and litigation drove these concentrations down dramatically. Again, similarly, we see the same thing with the fluorinateds. This was before the establishment of the MCL. About 80% drop in blood levels in Americans over the past 20 years. This is a diagram that has bothered me. It's been presented by numerous agencies in the United States, giving one the impression that this chemical can affect nearly any organ in the body or system in the body. That is probably not a correct characterization unless you want to discard the importance of dose. When you start thinking about the doses to which people are normally exposed, it does not produce a myriad of unknown or known effects. It's improper in my view to characterize any chemical like this because it tells the public, who knows, any of these problems you have in your body could very well be caused by PFAS, and I think it's a disservice to the public to portray any chemical like this without lots and lots of context. So, but that's where we are, and I understand how we got here, but again, I think it's a disservice to the public, and we should really tone down the rhetoric and stick to the facts. In my view, the reason they're unjustified is chemicals, thankfully, usually have one or two target organs, and that's just the way toxicology and medicine work. If it weren't that way, one person could take aspirin and cure their headache, and the next person might get liver disease, and the next person might have neurological problems. That's not what you expect from a pharmaceutical agent, and you shouldn't expect that from an industrial chemical. They are all focused on one or two tissues and very dose dependent as to when that response is significant. We know that from inhaled benzene and acute myelogenous leukemia. We know this from inhalation of chrome 6 and lung cancer, inhaled vinyl chloride angiosarcoma of the liver, and BCME and lung cancer. It's just the way medicine and toxicology work. As I said, one can't help but think they're similar. If not really similar, there's a story to be had here. But I hope I've convinced you they have a lot of similarities. Uneven acute toxicity across species. The humans and rodents appear quite different regarding toxicity. Relatively long biologic half-lives. Wasting syndrome, an unusual response at high doses in some animals, but not humans. Low genotoxicity, another hallmark of these large chemicals, high molecular weight chemicals, especially the ones that are lipid soluble, and very weak or no signal for carcinogenicity in humans. I think we're going to struggle for a number of years on what to do with the PFAS chemicals because, as I said, there's at least 800 of them that people are going to be concerned with, and I hope that we narrow that down to more like 100 to 150 and don't make our heads spin, but systematically break them into boxes and tackle them from a regulatory standpoint as different groups and not sit there and feel like we have to do 800 different regulations. We thought about that with the dioxins, and you know that we ended up coming up with relative potency factors for the dioxins and furans, and that's worked very, very well for 30 years. I hope that we can do the same thing with the PFAS chemicals. Risk communication, well, there's a real challenge. The dioxins were terrible with respect to risk communication, and the PFAS chemicals have gone down the same road, especially the last 4 years. In Jackson Hole, where I live frequently, they had this in the paper last year. PFAS are linked to multiple health risks, including cancer, thyroid disorders, developmental and reproductive complications, and decreased immune function. As I said previously, there aren't chemicals just don't do this. There's many, many reasons why you can't sit back and say it just messes up everything. Mechanism's important, and whenever you see this kind of helter-skelter, you have to say, I wonder what the real confidence is in these views. And I think it's, like I say, it's a disservice to the public. We in the health sciences need to communicate crisply and honestly and remember dose and talk about level of confidence. To me, a big, big problem has entered into epidemiology the last 40 years because we moved from causal to linked or associated. These words are dangerous. I think it did start with the dioxins in 1982. The C8 panel used the words probable link for cancer and PFAS. They didn't use the word causal, probable link. It's confusing and misleading. I know when I was in school, which was quite a while ago, I got my PhD in 82. Up to that time, it was almost necessary to get an MD and a PhD in statistics or biostatistics before you could call yourself an epidemiologist. And I remember distinctly at the University of Michigan and at Purdue, the professor saying it's very, very important for an epidemiologist to link biologic plausibility with medicine. So, unfortunately, linked and associated is not causation, or fortunately, it's not causation. And we saw just this last week how much confusion arose when the Tylenol announcement came out, and it said the, the Tylenol was associated with autism. And the argument began between the various government organizations about the difference between causal and associated. And I hope that debate and discussion influences America as to how they evaluate newspaper reports. I think the next 2 weeks are going to be fascinating as to how Americans get very familiar with the difference between associated, linked, and causation. As I said at the beginning, the PFOS, PFOA regulation for drinking water will be the most impactful action of the past 40 years, or not. As I said, originally 2016, some people call it the Obama guideline. It was 70 ppt in drinking water. EPA promulgated an MCL of 4 ppt for each of these two chemicals in 2024. It's currently tied up in the courts. I cannot predict what's going to happen. What was interesting is OMB claimed to do their economic analysis with high confidence, or at least moderate confidence, even though they didn't have all the data. Today, in 2025, we know that 10,000 water purveyors will soon be evaluated. 9,000 have been released. And interestingly, the hazard index for the non-PFOA, non-PFOS, PFAS were not over 1. In other words, they're not considered hazardous, the other PFAS in drinking water. And not that many had drinking water over 70 ppt, but 800 water systems, which involve millions of people, did have concentrations over 4, so they would fall under regulatory action. I don't think the exposure assessment has received sufficient attention. With all of the excitement in the news and researchers stumbling over one another trying to see who can find the next adverse effect and pleading for more regulation, I think it has escaped nearly everyone that 60% of intake of these chemicals appears to be due to seafood. 80 to 90% is not related to water. And not much drinking water is ingested, or at least tap water and home water brought to the home is ingested by humans. For most households, about 85 to 90% of treated water is used for dishwashers, washing machines, car washing, showers, watering lawns and gardens. It's not drank. In fact, very few people drink tap water today. They take in a large amount of bottled water, coffee, tea, and processed water. But straight drinking water, EPA says on the high side it could be 20% of Americans. Some say it's as low as 5%. What does that mean? As a result, it's plausible that if every water purveyor achieves the 4 MCL or the 4 ppt MCL, the typical concentration of these chemicals in the blood may not change. It may not measurably decrease, and we'll have spent, as some predict, up to $1 trillion in controls and personal injury litigation. Personal injury litigation could be mind-bogglingly high. And we see that, in brief, aggressive regulation of the family of PFAS chemicals could have serious adverse effects on commerce, but perhaps no change in public health, because that's not where we're getting most of our PFOA and PFOS and the other fluorinateds. So this would be quite remarkable to put the nation in jeopardy of significant cost and loss of social benefits and for no measurable impact in public health. That's a possibility. In fact, the data today suggests that. Why that doesn't get more attention is unclear to me. I had two papers come out, one last week, one next week, to talk about this very issue. So does the U.S. approach to regulating chemicals need an overhaul? Um, for one thing, our PFAS position for drinking water didn't fit into the international way of assessing chemicals. Um, our MCL was unusually low. We set 4 ppt. Canada had set 100 ppt. The EU had set 150 ppt. In Australia, it was 600. These have been debated and changed over the last 12 months, but 18 months ago, this was the state of affairs. The other countries, whenever they see EPA make a decision, they quickly reevaluate their position because for the last 50 years, EPA was thought to be the most scientifically strong environmental body in the world. That's been put into question, and I could see that changing significantly over the next few years. I would like to think that we should consider changing our entire approach to regulatory matters with respect to industrial chemicals. Let me ask the question, should EPA have set an MCL of 100 in 2024 based on the World Health Guideline of 100 ppt with a mandated reevaluation in 2029? The history of the last 50 years of EPA, OSHA, and other regulations has been, let's get the whole thing taken care of today. Let's regulate it in a heavy-handed way. Very few decisions in our lives are made black and white, all or none. Why do we do that in environmental regulation? There's no good reason for that. It's not necessary. We could just as well have said, let's set it at 100 in 2024. If in 2029, just 5 years later, based on blood level data and new epidemiology data, we could set the MCL at 250, or we could make it low, like 50, 10, or 5. It would be much wiser to do a phased-in approach rather than cause economic havoc and litigation havoc for no good reason if it's not necessary, if it doesn't have to occur. So it's just our history with respect to regulatory issues really deserves, I think, to be reflected upon. I was impressed 35 years ago when I was working in Europe on the dioxins, and they used the approach that I'm suggesting here. They saw they had high aerial emissions for the dioxins. In Germany, in '86, they proposed a limit of 1 nanogram, but rather than adopt that very low limit, they adopted 10 and hoped that that would be adequate. And sure enough, 10 years later, they didn't need to lower it anymore. The blood levels had gotten to where they wanted to go. But they could have caused economic havoc because all combustors in the country virtually were over the 1 nanogram per cubic meter value. So there's a myriad of risk management challenges with the PFAS chemicals. The first one is, how do you weigh the precautionary principle versus objective risk assessment? The precautionary principle was proposed 50 years ago, which said if you are dealing with chemicals and uncertainty, it's always best to be overly cautious. I think 50 years of experience has told us that may not be the best approach. The next question that we've been facing for 30 years, how much emphasis should be placed on toxicology or epidemiology studies which are murky or equivocal? Probably not that much. They should provoke us and prod us to do more studies, but don't cause the nation to spend buckets of money and cause public alarm if you're not sure of it. What happens is that when you start bringing emotion to these decisions, you start spending money on things that don't benefit you and avoid regulating the things that deserve to be regulated. And we have dozens of examples of that. And then really, how do you put a monetary value a policy versus data about possible adverse effects, plausible adverse effects, and likely adverse effects. Each of those is quite different, and we try to put a price tag on those without really careful thought. So my closing thought is this. There have to be lessons learned from the 20 years of working on the dioxins and how we should evaluate scientific and regulatory initiatives that we had done on the dioxins, and then compare against how to handle PFAS in the coming years. That's all I have. Thank you very much, and I hope you find this a bit thought-provoking. The paper that came out last week had a similar title to today's talk, which was Can 4 Decades of Experience with the Dioxins Inform Us Going Forward with PFAS? I don't know that disclosure is needed, but no entity provided financial support for this lecture, and the comparative analysis of dioxins, furans versus PFAS chemicals. And so far, I've not testified as an expert witness in litigation with respect to PFAS or the dioxins. Thank you very much. And again, thank you for the award. I can't tell you how important it was to me. Thank you.